Can you trust the advertised EPA range of electric cars? Well, the answer is no. But let me tell you about which EV brands have the best and the worst real-world range compared to their advertised EPA range. And then I will be joined by the host of the State of Charge YouTube channel, Tom Moloughney, who will tell us how the EPA rating is even calculated, which is a crazy story in itself. Tell us about his own real-world testing, which he has done plenty of, and tell us why there is such a difference between the two. And then, as always, I will take questions from you, my live audience. So let's get going right now. Welcome to E4 Electric. I am broadcasting live from Las Vegas, Nevada. Yes, I am back. I was in Phoenix, Arizona last week. After the Thanksgiving break, I will be heading to Texas, Austin, Dallas, Houston, and then back here for CES, of course, and I'll broadcast live from one of the automakers' booths for you guys. So that should be fun. All right, first of all, let's be very clear. The furthest range that any electric car has right now still belongs, EPA or real world, to Lucid Air. That's not what we're going to talk about because that's a clear winner for now. We're going to talk about the EPA rating that we all know and talk about all the time and the real world range that you get from electric cars, which a lot of times is very different. Now we're going to talk about why. Let's talk about three best and I would say most honest actual EPA ratings of electric cars and three worst. And by the way, let me know in a comment section or in a chat as you're watching me right now, which ones do you think made the top three? Meaning if the car goes further than its EPA rating, it's more honest. If it's less, then it's less. Okay, we get it. All right, first let's start with the best, right? Let's start with the positive and a couple of honorable mentions. One is Ford. You know, Ford EPA rating for both F-150 Lightning and the Ford Mustang Mach-E, in the real world, most of the time it beats the EPA rating, which is great. I mean, this is like amazing. I have never driven a car with a better real world rating than the EPA. I don't know how that feels, but it must feel really good. And on average, it seems like it beats it by about 5 to 10%. So, you know, under-promising, over-delivering, great for Ford. And, you know, as you can see, I'm talking about generally the brands rather than each model, because once the brand kind of gets their own, how they set the EPA ratings, it looks like it goes through the entire lineup. And Tom will correct me if I'm wrong on that. And the second one goes to the Where Are They Now edition. And we're going to go all the way back to 2016, where Kia's first generation Niro EV was released with a 239 miles of EPA rating. But many people, including myself, when I test drove it in Santa Cruz, California, got closer to 300. So now, obviously, it's no longer for sale. You can only buy it used, and most of the time the battery is a little bit depleted. But that was great. Now, let's get to the top three. And number three surprised me when I was doing the research because it belongs to BMW. And the reason it surprised me because you guys know how unimpressed I've always been with an i3. And that was not exactly a great performer compared to the EPA rating. But the iX, and now we'll have more data with an i4, is great. Now, the EPA rating is 324, which is, you know, really awesome. But it looks like everybody who's been testing it is getting consistently higher rating, 340, 350 miles even. So that's why number three spot belongs to them. And by the way, all of these are so fragile. Like I really had to crunch some numbers and drink a lot of coffee. So number two, Mercedes. And, you know, I'm already doing a video about the fact that Mercedes has the most electric cars than any other brand. If you count Volkswagen Group as a group, another brand, Mercedes-Benz has quite a few. They just don't want to tell us for some reason. But their EQS, which has been on the market for a while now, has a 350-mile EPA rating. But in real world, and I think including Tom, it's actually getting closer to 400-mile range, and I would expect the same from the others that are coming in and already on the market, EQB, EQA, EQE. A lot of them are coming to the United States, so we'll get the real world range here in the United States. I'm looking forward to that. And I love the EQS, especially the SUV, because SUV looks pretty good, and inside is just heaven. Honestly, I love that part. All right, let's get to number one. And you guys know that I am not a big fan of Porsche Taycan, but I got to give them all the credit in the world here. Porsche Taycan, by far, and they have like a million different models, including the Gran Turismo. consistently they're getting not just more real world range miles from all of their cars all throughout the land, but I mean like way more. So for example, one of the lower range ratings they had from EPA is 203, which, if you look at it, you go like, not a good job, Porsche. But then consistently, many people, including Tom, have gotten 250 to even closer to 300 of the real world miles. Now, I don't know why they did it to themselves, and I think Tom will definitely shine more light on that because he spent so much time with Porsches. I'm honestly, I'm surprised he's not making some sort of car payments on them. So we'll ask him. But let's get to the liars now. The worst top three, and once again, I'm going to start with an honorable mention because that's a Nissan Leaf. To probably nobody's surprised, when I also, and this is why it's hard to do, because when I tested the Nissan Leaf, what I found the worst kind of a thing to do was to turn the heater on. That really affected the range a lot, where some cars, like including my ID4, the heater and AC don't affect the range as much. So Nissan Leaf. All right, now let's get to top three. Number three, and I think if you own the Tesla, you're not surprised that they're there. In general testing that I see, they're underperforming by about 10% or so. Now, it wasn't my experience. My experience was about 20-30%. But again, it is so hard to do because, it depends on the weather and the wind and the temperature and just so many things. For me, even though I lived in California at that time, I always budgeted 20 to 30% of the lower range. All right, now let's talk about number two. And I got to tell you, this one surprised me. Hyundai. Now, Hyundai Kona EV was getting really good range, their first generation, compared to the EPA. I think the EPA rating was 258, and it was much like a Kia Niro EV was getting closer to 300. That's not the case with the Ioniq 5. Unfortunately, Ioniq 5 is getting about 10, 15. I even seen minus 20% of what the EPA rating is. I don't know what it is with the company. Like I said, most of the time, once the company figures out how to do their EPA rating, they go with it. But I got to tell you, overall, Ioniq 5, even though I'm not crazy about their looks, it is an excellent electric car in terms of how much money you pay for it versus range and the charging. But unfortunately, it looks like it is underperforming, which brings me to number one, which also actually surprised me. Believe it or not, number one spot belongs to Rivian. And it looks like the testing goes between 10 and 20% below the EPA range for R1S mainly. I mean, R1T mainly, but R1S is pretty much the same car. I have to say, that was a surprise for me. So those are top three and bottom three, but for real information here, and I gotta tell you, Tom knows so much more about this than most people I've ever seen. Then this is the time for him to jump in and talk about it. Tom, welcome to the channel. How are you doing, my friend?
Hey, Alex, how's it going? Doing fine.
All right, well, listen, shine some light here for me. First of all, why is it so hard? I mean, my brain was hurting just to look at the numbers, but when you're doing it, which you are all the time, why is it so hard to figure out what the real world range is of an electric car?
Because there's no such thing as real world range.
Explain that a little bit. I understand that the reality is different for everybody.
Yeah,
Why?
and not just for everybody, but almost for every time you get behind the wheel. It depends on how fast you drive, how your right foot behaves, right? How hard you press that pedal when you launch. If there's wind, what the topography is, if you're going uphill this time, if you use your regenerative braking to its, best capability on this drive. So that's the thing, and this is the same thing with gas vehicles. Every time you drive your gas car, you don't get the same miles per gallon. So it's a moving target range. There isn't like one specific range for EVs. And that's one of the reasons why you had mentioned Kyle Connor before for Out of Spec and we're good friends. And we try to range test the same vehicles relatively closely to each other in different states, and we compare our results. We hope that will be consistent. And sometimes we're very consistent when we do these highway range tests. We do these 70 mile an hour highway range tests, which is only one specific type of driving, 70 miles an hour. But then there's sometimes, Alex, where we'll have the same car and we'll drive it from 100% down to zero at a constant 70 miles an hour, and our results will be different. vastly different sometimes. So that's why I'm saying it's really hard to put a thumb on and say that's the range.
All right, now what would be the right way to do it? Now I gotta tell you, the reason I heavily relied on your testing because I think you're doing it right. Doing it at 75 miles, which is essentially probably the worst case scenario. Because I mean, even if we go, I think the highest speed limit in America is 75. I think there's maybe one or two states with 80, but 75 is really the fastest you should go safely on the freeway. And unlike the gas cars, that's where you get the worst performance. So essentially, you're doing the worst case scenario for a car. I like that. I think that should be standard for everybody, honestly. But why do you do it this way? And what do you think would be the perfect way to do it if there is one in the real world?
Yeah, so I'll answer that last question quickly. There's no perfect way of doing it because we all drive differently. We all have different driving routines. We picked the 70 miles an hour, Kyle and I. So just so we had to decide, and we kicked this number around for a while earlier, 3 years ago when we first started doing range tests. We're like, well, should we do 65 miles an hour? That's, a lot of the national speed limits in some states is 65. Should we go higher? Should we do 80? But we settled in on 70 and said, you know what, we're going to do all our tests at that and we'll be very consistent. We'll do the same protocol. We'll DC fast charge the vehicles right before we start so the battery's nice and warm. We put the vehicle in the most efficient driving mode. We turn on the HVAC to either 68 or 70 degrees, the fan setting on number one, the lowest fan setting. So all the cars get run with HVAC on. We inflate the tires to the manufacturer's suggested tire pressure. We don't overinflate them, underinflate them. We control as many things as we can. And then we monitor the wind with wind apps while we're driving to see, just so we can't control the wind, but we can at least tell that to the followers and say, look, we got a 15 mile an hour wind today. This is going to affect the test. I mean, that happened to me when I did my Rivian range test, my R1T range test. I had a pretty strong wind, and I think it contributed. I think it knocked a few miles off the test, but we can't control that.
All right, now here's a big question, because I remember when you told me, I was like, Tom, do you know how EPA rating is done? I think I asked you that several years ago. I was shocked that, first of all, it's not even done by the EPA, which is crazy. But tell us a little bit. I mean, I know there's a lot of nuances and stuff like that, but in a nutshell, for those of you guys who don't know, here's the story.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. It's surprising that this is how it's done, but it is how it's done. And the automakers lobby the EPA to have some control over this. You would think they give the EPA a car, the EPA tests it, and it's done. That's not how it works. The manufacturer does the EPA testing themselves, and then they provide a report to the EPA, and the EPA can then decide if they trust the automaker and just take it at face value and certify it, or if they say, well, this is all good, but give us one of those cars because we're going to double check your results. And they do that sometimes, but they don't do it for nearly all of the cars. So most of the cars out there you see are not certified by EPA, but it gets even more complicated. The automakers have two testing procedures that they're allowed to choose from. They get to decide which test they want to take, which is kind of crazy. But
I wish that was the rule in high school when I was doing all the tests to get my grades up.
The easy test or the hard test. So, and there kind of is one easy test and one hard test. There's a 3-cycle test where the vehicle's put through 3 different test protocols, 3 cycles they call it. And then once the results is done, and they're not difficult cycles. So what happens is the car gets, the final result will be much further than what the car can actually do. But if you do the 3-cycle test, then you have to discount it by close to 30%. So if you did your 3-cycle test and let's say you came up with a 300-mile range, you'd have to knock 90 miles off it and certify it at 210 miles. And that's because the test is easy, and also because it doesn't include heating and cooling the battery. It doesn't use HVAC, which is what you use when you're driving, what most people use most of the time when they're driving. So that's why they have to discount and just lop like 30% off the top. But then there's a 5-cycle.
Oh, there's more. Good.
They can choose the 5-cycle test, which is a more strict test. You do the 3 cycles that the 3-cycle test is. Then you do 2 more tests, which are tougher. And then the average of all those, I don't know if they're weighted exactly evenly, but they average all 5 tests, and then that's what your EPA range rating is. You don't have to discount like you do with the 3-cycle test. Most automakers choose to do the 3-cycle test. And the weird thing about it is when I when I've asked automakers about it, they've said, well, we think it's more representative of the true range, but also it's easier and it costs less for us to do it. Like you would think something that important wouldn't be based on spending a few dollars more when they spend billions like research and development. But anyway, so there's a 3-cycle test and a 5-cycle test. Most of the automakers today use the 3-cycle test, the easy one. Most of the legacy brands, the startups, the new companies like the Rivians, the Teslas, they use the 5-cycle test, and that typically generates better results. But they're not the only ones. There's some legacy brands that use them too. Audi's been using it for a while. Volkswagen, I think that some of their vehicles are certified 3-cycle, but now some of them are certified with 5-cycle.
When you say better results for their advertising campaigns, not for us, okay, yeah. So is that why we're seeing, Tesla and Rivian, essentially being in the bottom 3? Is that because of the way they performed it?
So, if you want to talk about bottom 3 as related to what their EPA range is, Tesla, for instance, has great range on all their vehicles, but I've tested all of their vehicles, and I consistently get somewhere between 10 and 13% less range driving at 70 miles an hour than what their EPA range rating is. And that's unusual. That's a bigger range discrepancy than what I see with other vehicles. And I do think it's because they use the 5-cycle test.
Okay. And, but the Ioniq 5 somehow snuck into the bottom 3. Whereas I mentioned Kona EV was one of the most perform cars before that. Why did that happen?
Alex, I don't have a specific answer for that. The all-wheel drive version has a heat pump. So, if people were tested in cold weather, that should have helped, not steal too many miles of range from it. And, honestly, like I said, it's really hard to say it's bad in relation to its EPA range rating because there's so many different ways people drive. For my Lightning, for instance, I have an F-150 Lightning that's EPA range rated at 320 miles. If I drive it normally around town, I'm getting well over 300 miles of range, close to 330, 340. I might be able to beat the EPA. But when you hop out on the highway, I get about 270, 275. So, I think a lot of the range tests you're looking at were highway range tests where the aerodynamics of the Ioniq 5 isn't probably as good as some of the other competing vehicles in that class. And I think that's what robs it of its range. Aerodynamics has an enormous say in how far the vehicle goes on the highway.
All right, now here's a good question because, EPA rating is obviously for America. In Europe, they use WLTP. In Asia, specifically in China, use something different. So OSR Garage asks, why does European use the WLTP when it's nowhere near the actual range? And I do have to admit that WLTP is even more generous, I would say, than EPA.
Well, it's only slightly more generous. From my research, it's about 15% more generous than EPA. It replaced what Europe used to use called the NEDC, which was like 33% more range than what the EPA was. The NEDC was just, folly. It was complete, you couldn't rely on it at all. They did a better job with WLTP for sure. And do I have an answer why they don't have a more better testing, more accurate? No, I don't know why. I would imagine part of it is the automakers lobbying these government bodies and saying, hey, don't be too hard on us because no one's going to buy our cars if these numbers look really bad. So, that's what happens.
All right, Tom, as always, this has been educational and fun. Thanks so much for joining me, and happy Thanksgiving, happy holidays, and I'll see you next week.
You too, and happy Thanksgiving for all the E for Electric followers out there. I'll see you guys next week.
All right, and of course, it goes to the State of Charge followers. And by the way, if you're not subscribed to State of Charge, I think you're crazy. You should, as you can probably you know, it was just demonstrated that there's a tons of knowledge to be had there. Tom does these tests. If you ever want to know about how far your car will go in real life, you watch Tom's videos. Same thing goes for chargers, whether it's home or public charging and stuff like that. So the link is already, as always, in the description of this video. You can click on his icon as well. Must subscribe channel. Of course, next week, Tom will be back here dropping more knowledge on all of us. So, all right, guys, I am looking forward. Next week, I will be in somewhere in Texas, probably in Austin. Looking forward to that. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy holidays to all of you. Looking forward to all of your comments. Other than that, see you guys next time. And remember to stay charged.